I found my daughter-in-law's mother pacing the driveway in her robe at 11 at night, and it took me a solid 3 seconds to understand what I was looking at, because behind her, through the kitchen window, my son was standing at the stove with his back to the house, stirring something on the burner, and somewhere upstairs my wife was screaming. Not crying, screaming. Welcome back, friend, if you've watched one of these before, and welcome in if this is your first time sitting down with me. Drop me a comment and tell me what part of the country you're calling home from tonight, because I read every one of them, even the ones that come in at 2 in the morning when I can't sleep either. Hit that like button if this story earns it. Subscribe if you want to hear the rest of what happened, because I promise you, this isn't finished the way you think it's going to be finished. My wife's name is Loretta, 41 years married this coming September, and in that whole stretch of time, I have watched that woman apologize for things that were never her fault, hold her tongue at Thanksgiving tables when she had every right to raise it, and drive 3 hours round trip every Sunday for 6 years just to sit with her sister after the stroke, reading her the parts of the newspaper she used to like best, the obituaries and the crossword, in that order, because Loretta said you had to know who you'd lost before you could enjoy anything else. She keeps a coffee can on the windowsill full of buttons from every shirt of mine that's ever worn through, going back to shirts I don't even own anymore. I asked her once why she saved them. She said because somebody ought to remember what got worn out doing what. My name is Everett Doss. I'm 63 years old, and for 31 of those years I've run a small fleet of tow trucks out of a lot on the edge of Tulsa, Oklahoma. 4 trucks, 6 drivers, a business my own father started with 1 truck and a CB radio in 1974. Until the night I'm about to tell you about, I would have told you I understood my family. I would have told you that plainly, without hedging, the way you tell somebody the sky is blue. That's the mistake in this story, if you're looking for one early. I understood the version of my family that showed up for holidays and smiled for pictures. I never once asked myself what that same family looked like on an ordinary Tuesday when nobody was watching. I'd been up in Joplin for 3 days at an equipment auction, looking at a flatbed I'd had my eye on for months, and the seller backed out of the sale a day early over some title paperwork mess, so I got back on the road sooner than I'd told anybody. I didn't call ahead. That's a habit of mine, and Loretta's told me for years it's going to catch up with me one of these days, walking into my own house like a stranger, checking if the place is haunted. I remember thinking, driving those last 20 minutes down Highway 75 with the windows cracked, that I'd stop and get her that peach cobbler from the diner she likes off Memorial, the one that's only good on Thursdays because that's when they make it fresh. I had the box balanced on my knee when I turned onto Willow Bend and saw my son Dalton's truck in the driveway, and behind it, an SUV I half recognized as belonging to his wife's mother, a woman named Carol Ann who I'd maybe spoken 40 words to in the 3 years since Dalton married her daughter Brianne. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual, but the house felt wrong the second I stepped into it, and I want to try to explain what I mean by that, because it's hard to put into words that don't sound foolish after the fact. It was quiet in a busy way. Somebody was cooking. I could smell onions going in a pan. Dalton was at the stove with his back to the door, earbuds in, one hand stirring, the other tapping along to whatever he was listening to. And Carol Ann's SUV was outside, but Carol Ann herself was standing in my driveway in her bathrobe when I pulled in, which should have told me something was already unraveling before I even got out of the truck. And upstairs, through the ceiling, I heard my wife of 41 years make a sound I had never once heard her make in all that time. Not a cry. A scream, short and cut off, like she'd caught herself midway through it, out of some old habit of not wanting to be a bother to anybody. I put that cobbler down on the counter without a word, and Dalton didn't even turn around. I don't think he heard the door. I took the stairs 2 at a time, something my knees are going to make me pay for later, I'm sure, and I found Loretta in the upstairs bathroom, sitting on the closed toilet lid with a hand towel pressed hard against her forearm, blood coming through it in a way that told me the towel had already given up doing its job. Her face was gray, not pale. Gray, the color a person goes when they've been managing pain alone for longer than their body wants to allow. "Loretta," I said, and I was down on the tile in front of her before I'd even set my keys down. "I'm okay," she said, which is the exact thing she always says. And in 41 years I have never once heard her say it, and had it turn out to be true. She'd been coming down from cleaning out the gutters on the back porch overhang, something she does every fall whether I ask her to or not, because she says a man my age doesn't need to be up on a ladder anymore, and I've never had a good answer to that. The extension ladder had shifted on wet leaves, and on the way down, she'd caught her arm on the aluminum gutter edge itself, a clean, long gash that had opened up nearly to the bone along the outside of her forearm. She thought maybe 10 minutes had passed, maybe closer to 15. She wasn't sure, because at some point in there, she said, everything had gone a little sideways in her vision, and that's when the sound I'd heard from the driveway had come out of her. One single scream. Before she caught it back and told herself to be quiet and handle it, the way she has told herself to be quiet and handle things for as long as I've known her. I asked her straight out if anybody downstairs had heard her. She looked toward the bathroom door before she answered. The same way I imagine anybody looks toward a door when the truth living behind it is worse than the lie they could tell instead, and that look told me most of what her words were about to soften. Carol Ann heard her fall, she said. Carol Ann had come up, seen the blood, gone back downstairs, and told Dalton, who'd said, and Loretta repeated this to me word for word later. Once the adrenaline had worn off enough for her to remember it clean, Dalton had said, "She's tough, Mom, she's fine, we're in the middle of dinner," and gone back to stirring his onions. Carol Ann, to her enormous credit, and I want to say this plainly because it matters to how this story ends, had not accepted that answer. She'd gone back upstairs herself, found Loretta far worse than a woman being tough, and had been the one to call me. Except my phone was in the truck charging and I hadn't heard it ring. So she'd come back out to the driveway in her bathrobe, phone in hand, trying to figure out what to do next, right as my headlights turned onto Willow Bend. I want to be clear about something here, the same way I'd want a friend to be clear with me if our situations were reversed. I did not yell. Not then, not in that bathroom. I got a clean towel from the hall closet, the good ones Loretta keeps for company, that she is going to be very upset with me for using once this heals up, and I wrapped that arm tight, and I got my wife down those stairs and into the truck, and the entire time, I could hear the stove fan still running down in that kitchen, onions still cooking, nobody following us out to the driveway to ask if we needed help. St. Francis on Yale Avenue put 14 stitches into that arm, and the doctor, a young man who looked barely older than Dalton, told me that another half hour without pressure on it, and we'd have been talking about a transfusion instead of a Saturday morning discharge. 14 stitches. I remember the number the way you remember a phone number from childhood. Useless now, but permanently lodged. The nurse who stayed with us most of that night, a woman named Priscilla, maybe 55, with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, asked me once, gently, whether anyone had been home when it happened. I told her the truth. 2 people had been home. She didn't say anything else about it, but she didn't need to. The look on her face said she'd seen this particular kind of quiet before, and it never sat right with her either. Here's the part of this story I need you to sit with, friend, because it's the part that told me, without a shadow of doubt, who was actually in my corner, and who was just occupying space at my table on holidays. While Loretta was getting stitched up, Carol Ann showed up at the hospital. She hadn't been asked to come. She was still in her bathrobe, under a coat she'd thrown on, and she'd stopped at a gas station on the way and bought Loretta a bag of the sour orange slice candies Loretta keeps in her purse, but never buys for herself because she says they're a foolish thing to spend money on. Carol Ann had noticed that habit in 3 years of holiday dinners. She sat with us the entire 5 hours we were there. She held Loretta's good hand while they numbed the arm for stitches. At one point, Loretta tried to apologize to her for the trouble, for the inconvenience of it, and Carol Ann looked at her and said, "Loretta, honey, you didn't do this." Somebody just didn't listen when it mattered. And she said it plain, no drama in her voice, like she was just stating a fact of the day, the way you'd mention it was supposed to rain. Dalton didn't call until almost midnight, and only then because Brianne, his wife, had gotten home from her own shift at the hospital where she works as a billing coordinator, found the house empty, and her own mother gone, and called Dalton to ask, What in the world was going on? He called my phone, and I let it ring twice before I answered, mostly so Loretta wouldn't have to hear his voice before she was ready. "Hey, is Mom doing okay?" "Carol Ann said something happened," he said. "And I want you to notice the wording there, friend, because I noticed it immediately. Not, what happened to Mom? Something happened." I told him. 14 stitches. Almost a transfusion. There was a pause on that line, not a long one, maybe 3 seconds. And then he said, "Man, that's scary." "Well, she's tough though, right? She'll bounce back." That phrase, "She's tough though, right?" I have turned that phrase over more times in the 2 weeks since than I care to admit to you. Not because he was wrong that Loretta is tough. She is, God knows she is. But because somewhere in my son's head, his own mother bleeding through 2 towels in an upstairs bathroom while he stirred onions 8 feet below her, had gotten filed away next to a stubbed toe. An inconvenience that would sort itself out because it always had before. I didn't say much back to him that night, and that's the truth, not the version I'd like to tell you where I gave him both barrels right there on the phone. I told him we'd talk when I got home, and I hung up, and I sat in a plastic hospital chair next to my sleeping wife's bed, and thought about every excuse I had built for that boy over the last several years without ever once being asked to build one. Dalton's just stressed with the new baby coming. Dalton didn't mean anything by it. Dalton's not good on the phone, never has been. It doesn't mean he doesn't care. I had been doing that boy's explaining for him for so long that I believe I'd genuinely forgotten it was supposed to be his job to explain himself. I want to tell you I drove home and had it out with him the next morning, man to man, the way you see in the movies. That's not what happened. And I promised myself a long time ago on this channel that I would tell you these stories straight, not dressed up prettier than they actually were. What happened is I went quiet. I went to work that Monday, came home, helped Loretta manage that arm through 2 dressing changes a day for a week, and I did not call my son. He texted twice. Both times, just, "Hey," checking in, nothing after it. Like he was waiting to see if enough silence would eventually just dissolve on its own, the way it always had before between us. It didn't dissolve this time. Something in me had shifted that Thursday night, and I want you to understand it wasn't loud when it happened, not even inside my own head. It was quiet, like a porch light you don't notice is off until you're standing in the dark reaching for a door handle you can't see. I built a business out of a single tow truck over 31 years, and if that work taught me anything, it's how to recognize, without much sentiment attached to it, the exact moment a decision has already been made somewhere underneath you, and you're just the last one catching up to the news. Now here's where I have to back up on you a little, because there's a piece of this you don't know yet, and Dalton doesn't know it either. 6 years ago, Loretta's father, a man named Wendell Pruitt, who ran the only hardware store in a town called Coweta for 34 years before he passed, left behind a trust that split between his 3 grandchildren once they turned 30. Dalton is the oldest of those 3, and the only one who's already crossed that line, which means his share was scheduled to release in full this coming January, 4 months from the night I'm telling you about. It wasn't a fortune by any means, but it was real money. The store building itself, which we'd been leasing out to a farm supply company for years, along with an investment account, Wendell built slow and unglamorous, over 3.5 decades, of never once spending more than he made. Dalton knew there was something coming his way in January. Families talk about these things in vague, comfortable terms even when nobody says a real number out loud. And I have come to believe that vague, comfortable knowledge of money on its way had made my son a little too relaxed about the price of being decent to the people it was coming from. I hadn't touched that trust paperwork since Wendell passed. I called the family's estate attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Dolores Vance, who's had her office on Cherokee Street longer than Dalton's been alive, on the Monday after we got home from the hospital, and I sat across the desk from her that Thursday and told her exactly what I wanted changed. I did not do this in anger. I want you to hear that from me directly, because I know how a story like this can sound if you only catch the outline of it. I did it because I finally let myself sit with a plain question I should have asked myself years before that night. If something happened to me tomorrow, Who would actually show up for Loretta the way Carol Ann showed up in that hospital waiting room, unasked, unpaid, still in her bathrobe? Who had already answered that question for me, without knowing they were even being tested? Dolores drew the amendment up over the following 2 weeks. Loretta's own portion of that trust stayed entirely hers, untouched, hers to do with as she someday chooses. But the portion earmarked for Dalton, the language in Wendell's original trust, got restructured. Instead of releasing to Dalton outright in January, it now funds a trade scholarship through the vocational program at the Technology Center in Broken Arrow, in Wendell's name, for young people learning a trade the way Wendell once did, with nothing but a rented storefront and a stubborn streak. And a smaller, separate provision, the store building itself, passes instead to Carol Ann. In recognition, the document reads, extraordinary and unasked-for care shown to Loretta Doss. Carol Ann doesn't know yet. Nobody knows yet except Dolores, Loretta, and me, sitting here telling you this tonight. Loretta cried when I told her, and friend, it was not the same crying I'd heard through that bathroom door. She asked me twice if I was doing this out of spite, and I gave her the honest answer both times. I told her I wasn't spiteful about a single piece of it. I was simply done building the next chapter of our life around the assumption that Dalton would eventually grow into the man we kept telling each other he already was. The conversation with Dalton, when it finally happened, wasn't loud either, and I believe that surprised him more than shouting ever could have. It was a Sunday, 3 weeks after the fall, and he drove out on his own, no call ahead, same as I'd done that Thursday, without meaning to teach anybody a lesson by it. Loretta was at the Technology Center that afternoon, if you can believe the timing, sitting in on an open house for the very scholarship program that now carries her father's name, something she's taken to doing most weekends now with Carol Ann riding along beside her. Dalton found me out in the shop behind the house and asked, straight out, why I'd gone quiet on him, and why Brienne had mentioned that her own mother had been out to see Dolores Vance, a name Brienne only knew because Carol Ann had mentioned it once, confused about why an estate attorney wanted to sit down with her. I told him everything. The stitches, the onions. She's tough though, right? And the trust. He got very still, the way I imagine I must have looked standing in that bathroom doorway 3 weeks earlier, and he said, "So you're punishing me because of one bad night?" "No," I told him, and I want you to know my voice didn't rise saying it, because it didn't need to. I'm done pretending that one bad night was the first one. It was just the first one I finally let myself see clearly. He asked if there was anything he could do to fix it. I gave him the honest answer, which was that I wasn't holding this over him as a bargaining chip, that I wasn't fishing for an apology tour or a big gesture, and that the money, in the end, was never really the point of any of it. The point was 15 minutes in an upstairs bathroom, and how easy it had turned out to be for him to keep stirring his onions right through it. He left angry that afternoon, and as far as I know, he's still carrying some of that anger now. Brienne has tried to smooth things over between us twice since, and I appreciate a young woman trying. But Dalton hasn't once called his mother to ask how that arm is healing, whether the scar runs the full length of the gutter cut or just part of it. It does run the whole length, for what it's worth. 14 stitches leaves a mark you notice, even under a long sleeve. I'm not going to sit here and tell you this story ends with my son showing up at our door with flowers and everybody hugging it out on the front porch. It doesn't end that way. Some of you watching this tonight have lived a version of that softer ending, and I am genuinely glad for you if that's your story. This isn't that story. This is the story of a man who spent 3 decades assuming his son would eventually grow decent on his own schedule, and who finally stopped waiting around on that schedule to arrive. What I've got instead is quieter than any reconciliation would have been, and I'll admit it took me a good while to understand that quiet was enough on its own. Loretta's arm healed clean. The doctor tells us the scar will fade some more over the next year, though it'll never disappear entirely, and she says she doesn't mind that, says a body ought to carry a few reminders of what it's survived. Carol Ann still doesn't know about the store building. Not yet. We're waiting until the paperwork clears before we tell her. But she and Loretta have gone to church together, 3 Sundays running now, something neither of them had ever thought to do before, that night in the driveway. And some evenings it's the three of us, me, Loretta, and Carol Ann's husband, Gene, out on the back patio with sweet tea. Not talking about Dalton at all, just talking about ordinary things. Whether the tow business needs a fifth truck, whether the Sooners have a real shot this season. Small, unremarkable talk between people who have, without ever saying so out loud, decided they're family now. I used to believe that peace meant everybody eventually finding their way back to the same table. I don't believe that anymore, friend. I think peace is simply no longer needing them to. If this story landed with you tonight, I'd ask you to think for a minute about the people in your own life who show up without being asked twice, and the ones who make you ask 3 times and still stir their onions, even when it's your own mother bleeding upstairs while they do it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching this from tonight, and whether you've got a Carol Ann of your own out there. Give this one a like if you do. And subscribe if you want more stories about fathers who finally stopped making excuses for people who should have never needed one made. I'll see you in the next one.